It is Tuesday, and we are glad you're tuned to Law Matters, a show that is educative, informative, and offers legal aid solutions to what we face on our day-to-day lives. Tonight, we're having an interesting discussion concerning climate justice, because climate change is not only about rising temperatures and melting ice caps, it's also a human rights issue, given that due to climate change, people risk losing their livelihoods. Remember, you can send in your questions and feedback concerning this particular topic and discussion on our social media platforms at KTV Kenya on Facebook, on KTV Kenya on YouTube, and KTV_Kenya on Twitter. My name is Irene Mwangi, but before we debunk this particular topic on climate justice, let me allow my guest to introduce himself kindly.
Thank you, Irene. My name is Gibson Gisore, an advocate of the High Court of Kenya, an environmental law lecturer, and a climate change enthusiast. Basically, that's who I am for purposes of this discussion.
Thank you so much, Wakili Gisore, for making time. And let's begin with contextualizing the discussion concerning climate justice. People are used to climate change, and as a country, especially this particular regime, has been on the forefront talking about the issue of climate change, but not so much about climate justice, which is a ripple approach of climate change. Can you talk to us about what is climate justice and why it is important in any particular society in the country?
Thank you again. Climate justice is something, or is a concept which has come at the backdrop of climate change. We as the world, which we all live in, have accepted, or there is a kind of an understanding that climate change is here with us, and we need to do something about it. The concept of climate justice is whereby we need to ensure that all that have been affected get to be compensated, or the adverse effects which face them are able to be mitigated, as is the case with those who are in a better off place.
Okay.
So when we talk about climate justice, is basically to talk about equity under the aspects of compensation. The aspect of compensation is derived from the UNFCCC, which is the UNGA international document which talks about climate change at the UN level, which was signed in 1992, which among other things has the concept of polluter pays principle. Okay. When we talk about polluter pays principle, is that he who has caused the things which have been able to destroy the environment is supposed to be liable for essentially cleanup, for essentially compensating to do mitigation and adaptation, which are the key principles of climate change. And now this discussion over time has been realized that this is only happening for those who can be born in the developed West. So the third world country, or the southern hemisphere of which is largely affected, governments are not able to do mitigation. So that is the kind of discussion which has been established first in the Kyoto Protocol, which has since lapsed, and then it was inherited by the Paris Climate Change Agreement. That is where we have in every COP, people have to discuss and agree how much is supposed to be paid, who is supposed to pay, what is the medium, or what is the procedure for payment. So long and short of it is that if you have been able to listen or follow through the discussion at the climate change COPs, you will actually be able to realize that the discussion largely has been centered about the payments. How do you get to have these payments move from the West, come to the low economies on the South Pole, so that they can be able to deal with mitigation. For example, if I may just give simple examples, recently we have been able to experience flooding, which has really affected a lot of our people. There were heavy rains which we have never experienced. those are effects of climate change. The people who are affected are actually communities in the very low end. Along the Tana River, we saw even the Nairobi River for the first time was flooding, which moved the government to go and evict people for their own safety first, and also to ensure that the collateral effects are not so huge. So there's a cost to this. Evacuation of people, there's a cost to it. There's a cost to human life. Somebody is going to lose their house, their property. There's the children who cannot be able to go to school. People are going to go hungry because of that. So these are the monies which the people who pollute, the large emitters, essentially should be able to compensate for this. So that is what the concept of climate justice is all about.
All right. It is quite a broad discussion, bringing together, what we have locally and internationally.
Sure.
But looking into what we have, the legal framework that we have in the country, without looking into the international treaties of the Paris Agreement and what have you, as a country, do we have a framework, a legal framework to ensure justice in case of the pollutants here in the country and people who are mandated to focus on the issue of climate justice and climate issues?
You will actually be surprised that Kenya is way ahead of the rest of our peers in terms of coming up with a legal framework. We were the very first in the continent to come up with a Climate Change Act. Just right after the Paris Agreement had been signed, I think a year later, we were able to come up with a Climate Change Act. That has been in place, and that has really become the anchor under which any other legislation, for example, an act cannot be able to be a standalone document. You need regulations. You need to also come up with the other policy frameworks, especially to ensure that is effected. So that has been able to be put in place. There was a challenge with the act, but the act was later amended, and there is the Climate Change Act Amendment of 2023, which is now in force and has been able to open a lot of fronts. Some of the fronts which have been, some of the key take-homes will be FLOCA, which is largely all the monies now which have been received by the emitters are deposited at the Treasury. Under the Treasury had to come up with a mechanism to distribute these resources to the places, the exact places where these particular climate change effects have been felt for purposes of mitigation and adaptation. And that framework essentially sets us apart from with our peers because that has not been able to be put in place. Now the challenge we face as a country is that FLOCA deals with the counties. Okay. So for a county to be able to benefit from monies from FLOCA, essentially they have to also have their own climate change act in the county, and then they have got to have their policy, and then they need to have projects which are especially tailored to benefit from these monies. So the challenge we face is that most counties have not been able to, they are not actually even aware of the works of FLOCA. They have not been able to have climate change officials who can be able to advise them on the way forward. So there is the challenge of capacity building, which counties, especially the arid and semi-arid counties, should be able to take advantage of that and be able to collect some of these monies for purposes of mitigation and adaptation, and coming up with the projects for mitigation, and which can be targeted with these monies. Because those monies also, you need to be accountable. You can't just release the monies. So some counties have really benefited. Those ones which know, I think Makueni is one of the very first counties which came up with the Climate Change Act for a county. And they're well ahead of the other counties, and the other one which I'm aware of is Vihiga. They're doing very well because their governor also, when we were in the process of coming up with the Climate Change Act and he was a member of parliament, he really helped in pushing the policy and the Climate Change Act to be passed in parliament. It was our focal point.
In terms of
so
being the point
when he took the reins of power as a governor, he was able to implement the very same things which he was well aware and was pushing for.
Okay, so what happens to counties that because due to rural-urban migration, Nairobi County, which is home to many of the industries, and also the nearby counties, the likes of Kiambu, Machakos, they hold many of these industries, and people, due to the migration, we have people encroaching into areas where the industries, are close by. So in the case whereby a county like Nairobi has not taken advantage of having a legislation to take up this flocker money, then what is the avenue of climate justice for the people in Nairobi, Kiambu, Machakos, who will need compensation due to the effects of, climate change and abuse of the environment?
That's a very good question. Just to inform you, the High Court, the Environment and Land Court, I think a day or in the course of the week, they were, or even last week, I'm not sure, but recently they made a decision, a very interesting decision that gave life to the people who were affected by the people who were moved from the riparian places of Nairobi River.
Okay.
That, if you look at that judgment, it's talking about human rights.
Okay.
And when we're talking about climate change, we are not talking about climate change with the exclusion of humans.
Rights, yeah.
When there's human being, there is human rights, which is going to be discussed.
Yeah.
So the rights of these people were actually violated, which the court has been able to find as much. And it has ordered that they were going to be compensated. If Nairobi County was one of the counties which is in the forefront in terms of benefiting, some of these monies from Flocker will be able to be used to compensate these people, depending, now the compensation is personal. Now it depends on what you suffered. If it's your house which was destroyed, of course you'll get more money as opposed to somebody else who was just maybe a tenant and the only thing maybe, or didn't have a family.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things, because the court did not give a specific amount. It said an assessment should be able to be done so that they can be able to determine. And that's the beauty of things like climate change. You also don't jump into. You need to have climate change experts go in, and environmental experts, and be able to determine the intensity of our project, the level of mitigation, and the amounts. They are able to assess even the amounts which are supposed to go into mitigation and adaptation, or even to the people who have suffered this catastrophe. They also should be able to be compensated equitably. Okay. So there's need for experts. So this is a developing field which we need to have more experts on the ground.
Right. The
few who are there, they can be stretched across the country. You realize even in the counties which you consider that the North Arid and Semi-Arid, they also suffer these effects because there's flooding in Yala. I mean, that should count for something. The River Sound always floods. So across the country, we have some of these things. When we have droughts, we see animals dying in the Masai Mara. So somebody should be able to be responsible for that. So some of these things need a lot of in-depth academic research, which should be able to put the issues in context. So hence the clarion call really that we need to have more people trained in climate change so that we can be able to bargain for more.
Okay.
Kenya is one of the countries which has been in the forefront and has really gained a lot from the climate change as opposed to other peers in Africa. And South Africa, I think, also has also benefited because it was able to train its people earlier, and they were able to be certified to be able to analyze some of these projects. I think for some time, for the longest time, when the Kyoto Protocol lapsed, we only had South Africa experts who could be able to come and certify a project. So, but now in Kenya, we have been able to develop capacity, and that is something we need to be proud of. But more needs to be done, especially in terms of the counties, because they are the people who really are on the ground and they are able to interact with the people. The whole aspect about climate justice is about restorative justice, where you restore the people to the environment to where they were, which may not be a 1+1, because that needs to take a whole ecological system you do realize that we have some swamps which have dried up. To restore them is not a 1+1 thing. We have underground aquifers which have since dissipated. So some of these things, it takes time. That is why we need to commend also the government with their move of planting 15,000 trees, which are going to be very helpful in terms of restoring some of the. So this effort is through the national government to ensure that some of the monies which they might be using could be on Kenyan taxes, which because we also need to contribute to our own distractions, and some of the monies could be from which have been received from out there from the West towards mitigation. So those are some of the steps which we are making as a country to restore our country so that we ensure we are a climate smart country.
You've mentioned about, you've touched a bit about this question that I want to ask before we take our first break. You've mentioned about the arid and semi-arid counties, the likes of Tana River, which are down on the coast, and also the likes of Wajir, Garissa, and the northern eastern counties. But looking into the issue of Tana River, sometimes when we're having floods, they will say that the waters are coming from the upstream, the counties, Nairobi and what have you.
The Mount Kenya region.
Region and what have you, and now it is coming to destroy the county in the lowlands. So you've mentioned that at the moment we are lacking in terms of experts, in terms of assessment, but this particular community has been facing this particular issue. It's a perennial issue time and time again. How is it canvassed, given that maybe the county has not taken advantage of legislation? How is it to ensure that those people have climate justice? Because this is something that happens yearly, and we seem not to have a viable, sustainable solution to look into it.
I like the fact that we are talking about sustainable solutions. Now, the issue with Tana River is a fairly complex one, because it can, even if Tana River County passes their own legislation for climate change, they may not be able to alleviate some of the challenges they face, because the challenges are transboundary. The fact that they are transboundary, they move from their county all the way to Mount Kenya region. So some of these challenges could mean that there is a multiplier of solutions which needs to be put in place. For example, if it's flooding, we need more dams upstream, whereby they can be able to afford. We have the Seven Forks Dam, but really they are very old, and their capacity is also surpassed when especially there is major rains. So we need big mega dams. China has been able to be successful, and I think Brazil, in terms of, and these are countries which have big rivers. China has got the Mekong River, which on its side they have been able to do very big mega dams, and some of these things really can be able to contribute to the development of the country, because sustainable development also involves looking at some of these things. How do we also benefit people? How do we change a disaster to be able to benefit the people whom have been affected? So if dams are actually supposed to be put along the River Tana to ensure that most of the waters is well conserved, we can also be able to divert some of the waters to ensure that we do enough irrigation and storage. We do have other dams for storage, so that we can be used thereafter, so that they avoid some of these issues. But those need national planning. It needs a lot of national also looking for resources, because you cannot also only wait for monies from outside. So I think there's a plan to come up with a very big dam along between the county of Tarakaniti and Kutv. I don't know how far. I think the contract was awarded to some British, but I've never seen any British do any dam, so I'm hoping this one comes up. So once that is in place, it will really be able to maybe avert. You see, it's not only in Kenya. You see what the Ethiopians did. They had the same challenge with their Blue Nile. Blue Nile is one of the largest arms of the Nile, because it's said that water from the Blue Nile, once the Blue Nile is full, when they meet in Gezira in Sudan, the water from the White Nile, largely from Lake Victoria and Uganda, has to wait for 3 weeks to find pathway.
Yeah.
So that causes a lot of flooding. But what did the Sudanese do? They decided to put an irrigation, very big irrigation. And some of the sugar we eat, it's rumored to be coming from those sites.
Okay.
So they are turning a disaster or a catastrophe to their own advantage where they benefit from it. So I think the same should be able to apply for our brothers and sisters in Tana River and along the Tana River.
All right. I think with that we'll be able to take our first break. But do stay with us. We have much, much more to talk about the issue of climate justice and the issue of the society and where the government comes along. Do stay with us.
Interior design ni pana. Ina depends.
Thank you for staying with us. You're watching Law Matters. Tonight we're looking into the issue of climate justice and how we can ensure that people are accountable, in this case the stakeholders, the government, the private organization, as well as the communities, in terms of what is their part in the issue of climate change and the issue of climate action. Now, before we went for a break, we're bringing the discussion into context, looking into what climate justice is and what we're having at the country at the moment. Perhaps, what are some of the legal accountability measures for people who are supposed to ensure that climate issues are adhered to, and for the community that now needs to have the climate justice because their rights have been violated, in this case human rights? Do you have legal accountability measures, given that sometimes they will say that the companies, in this case maybe Nairobi, companies along Nairobi River are polluting that particular river, but there is no action taken into the big giants, yet the common mwananchi is being taken back and forth on this issue?
Yes, that's a very interesting discussion, especially in the Kenyan context. The reason I say as much is because right at the start I did indicate that we do have fairly served with enough legal framework. Under the MCA Act of 1999, some of these things were already anticipated. When you set up a factory, some of these things have been looked at, so that there is supposed to be perpetual audits to ensure that you're not emitting or dispersing things which destroy the environment. And largely, what we need is enforcement. Some of the enforcement mechanisms we have are very weak. You send a NEMA official to a company which is producing things which they rake in 10 billion a month. The man arrives there in a boda and he looks emaciated. So he's already... So he's supposed to check this industry and ensure that if he makes recommendations for them to be fined.
Yeah.
First, the mere presence of him in the factory is mesmerized.
Yeah.
It's mesmerized. So that aspect, we're not casting any suspicions, but we need a government which can bite, which can be able to enforce. So those are some of the things we need to ensure, because that's the responsibility of government, to ensure that some of these things are enforced, to ensure that the polluter pays if these people are found, and then the fine should be punitive. In other countries like the Western country of Germany, even if you have your vehicle, they cannot accept some vehicles which we have around here, because the emission levels are high. So they need to check from the manufacturer, yes, to recommend that actually this vehicle is fit for use in their market. So those are some of the things which we need to have. And in Kenya we are doing that. I participated recently in coming up with the policy regulations for EPRA, in terms of ensuring that any electronics which we bring into the country are actually sound, and that the emission levels are very low. And some of the challenges we were facing is the fact that we don't have our standards, so we had to craft one or adopt one from outside. If we were to adopt the European one, which is well known, then we are not in Europe. Then you need to find your framework. You need to also find your own framework. So we need, among other things, to have institutions which have been given enough capacity, and people who have been trained to understand some of these things. Recently, I was in a meeting coming up with the regulations also for air quality in Nairobi. You do realize through emissions, then we end up having Nairobi as one of the dirtiest air. So we do have experts, and I think they could not be more than 2 or 3 in the country. But then we need to put in place some of these regulations so that the county or the government is forced to come up with the people who can be able to be trained to be able to be enforcement officers. Actually, the part where we were trying to discuss who is supposed to enforce, we really debated on the issue of who is the expert, what level of education should be, because we don't have many. We need to ensure that. But then, you cannot make a law for a season. The law is for posterity and for sustainable development. So we had to put a very high level so that upon the county and the government to ensure that we have such people in place, by either taking their officials for training so that they can be able to qualify, and then they can be able to now build capacity from within. So that is, I think, something which we need to be proud of, and once the regulation should be able to be in place, we can be able to maybe have a cleaner environment in Nairobi where you can be able to comfortably walk, not developing another India or China. I am told Beijing in the morning you see it's like it's fog, it's like in the evening, and you've just woken up, you wonder where is the sun. You can't see it. You can't see it because the smog up there is really you cannot allow the sun ray to penetrate. So those are some of the challenges we need to start alleviating, because we are a developing country. Some of these things have to happen, so we need to develop sustainably so that we don't kill our kids while developing. And of course the issues of respiratory issues, of course, affect everyone, and we end up losing or using a lot of money in terms of healthcare, or losing a lot of people who should be contributing to the development of the country. So in terms of litigation, in terms of coming back to your question, is that we do have platforms whereby we have NEMA. NEMA has an arm which deals with net fund. Net fund is essentially supposed to ensure that polluter pays principle is enforced in the country. You can be able to report a polluter, and is supposed, if he's doing a project which is essentially is going to give emissions, or which is going to give rise to him being a polluter, they deposit some money under the what is called environmental bonds. These environmental bonds now acts as a safeguard, that in the event that your project ends up not meeting, then you are given back your money. If it's end up, then you lose it as a fine to the government, and this is the money which is essentially supposed to be used to restore or to compensate people who have been affected. How that is working, I'm not able to tell. I don't work at NEMA, but that's something they need to work on.
Okay.
The other aspect is the flocker, which we have already discussed, whereby the people affected, the county can be able to access some of these funds to compensate them or to do mitigation.
Okay.
You also don't wait for people to be affected. You can actually be able to do mitigation beforehand, and also after effect to do adaptation to ensure that you restore the environment, and now people do not continue suffering from some of these things. There are other things like cleaner mechanisms which are supposed to be employed by industries. This is something NEMA and the government should be able to enforce for factories or for industries which are emitters, to ensure that whatever they emit is environmentally sound. Even the emissions, the smog, you need to, there are now technologies which can be able to cap that and ensure that some of these things do not get emitted to the environment to affect our people. The other safeguard is through the courts. You can sue the government or the county directly as a Kenyan to seek compensation for some of the things. For example, the people who are affected by the floods in Nairobi can actually join together and be able to sue under climate change. Now, it's interesting that even our own courts, under the Environment and Land Court, which is an arm of the High Court, have been able to also establish the department which deals with climate change litigation, where somebody can be able to file. This is quite interesting because climate change litigation largely is in America. Europe, maybe 90% of litigation is in America. Around 8% is what is in, and then now the rest, the 2%, is spread across the world. So if we are able to operationalize that department and start having matters being filed there, then we will be contributing to the percentages going up from an African country, which is something which should be able to be proud of.
All right. So what is the issue then in the country? Because it seems like we sort of have some sort of a proactive approach, and as you mentioned earlier in our discussion, is that Kenya is among one of the countries that has been on the forefront in terms of legislation on climate change. Then where then are we missing it? Is it an issue of lack of a policy framework, lack of experts, the issue of corruption? Because again, even as we have this legal mechanisms, and NEMA has gone out of its way to have even an investment bond, we still, the community still face the wrath of climate change as if we are not really prepared for it.
The big challenge is climate change is fairly a new phenomenon. People are trying to wrap their heads around it, and then it's an expensive process. Being an expensive process, it means we need big money, which big money we cannot be. We cannot tax Kenyans to enforce the issues of climate change. That's why the polluter pays principle comes in handy. Whoever destroys needs to pay up. And then the issues of climate change are, it's not necessary that the harm we are experiencing here as Kenya is really caused by from around here. It could be something which, not that it could be.
It is.
The West is what largely has contributed to the challenges we face now. That is where we are trying to ask for climate justice, to ensure that they are able to, whatever they pollute, they are able to pay to the Southern Hemisphere countries or the South Pole countries to be able to fight through adaptation and mitigation and the compensation for some, especially the local communities. People who could be in Baringo. Yeah. You realize Baringo and Bogoria are almost meeting. Yeah. They are also almost merging into one. A lot of people have been displaced. Yeah. Who is supposed to be paying for these people? And the effects could have been done in California or in Beijing. So we need to have Beijing, we need to have California be able to give enough to our flocker so that we can be able to effect we can be able to take these monies to Baringo County, and then we saw the people who are there on the ground who have been affected. Around 15 schools have been closed, or they have been forced to move. So these are some of the things. We need to build new schools, we need to evacuate these people. These monies are the monies which we expect that they can be able to deal with some of these issues.
And as a country or as a globe, when it comes to assessment, to be able to put a nexus between environmental pollution that has led to this and this in this particular country, not only Kenya, even Tanzania and Uganda. Do you have an assessment to say what is happening in California has this ripple effect in Kenya, and therefore we are demanding this amount of money to be able to repatriate people affected by floods and what have you, or issues of global warming, the issues of drought? Do you have an assessment, given that this is majorly environmental and you cannot really say that I saw this? It's something that has to be assessed for a period of time.
Yes, there is an assessment. As the African, what the challenge has been as Africa, not only Africa but the global South, is largely that the global South is not able to negotiate for what is due to them.
Okay.
And the challenge being they don't have negotiators. The other challenge being there's influence from the West because they don't want a fair assessment, so that they'll be forced to pay it. And then thirdly, there is some sort of lethargy where people feel like, where do it? We are still living. I mean, we are so used to some of these challenges in a big way that and then it needs a lot of sensitization. I mean, we have talked about climate change being fairly a new thing. So the information about climate change, unless you've gone to school or you really understand it, and even if a leader is fairly literate, as some of the African leaders we have in place, then they can easily be compromised not to seek some of these monies. So it really takes a lot. It takes a lot for somebody to be willing. And then even if you are willing, you see climate change affects everybody. For example, in the whole of Africa, we are all equally affected. The Sahara Desert increases or moves downwards by 5 kilometers every year. So if the people in the Sahara region are not able to come and be able to ask for mitigation funds, you see, you cannot be able to claim it as Chad alone. It takes a collective effort of all the countries. So there is that. As Africa, we need to stand up and be able to negotiate. I like to pull this because I really loved the kind of way we were able to negotiate when the former Prime Minister, the late Meles Zenawi, was the leader of the Climate Change African Group. We were able to put a very strong position. I think that time either the COP we were going for was in Oslo or somewhere around there, and we were able to make a case. But during the process of negotiation, the Africans also get compromised. I remember, I think it's Nigeria which were approached and told, you guys mine oil. The oil mining process contributes fairly huge chunk of emissions because they do what is called flaring. Flaring is the Nigerian oil is mixed with gas. So for you to get only oil which you want, because you cannot and to separate it, they have to light it up. And that lighting it up, when you burn oil, it goes up into the space. And they are told, if we are going to discuss that you pay, we also need to discuss your case. So Nigeria was able to pull out. And you see, those are the tactics which the West keeps using to ensure that we do not have a common strong position. The recent case I can be able to give you that you can actually realize that there is very big influence and there's a lot of vested interest is the African Climate Change Summit, which our own president called in Nairobi. If you could be able to understand how people were destabilized, they were unhappy. Within that meeting, we were able to see the U.S. representative for climate change, Kerry, come here. We had a representative from Canada come here. And as Africans, we were supposed to sit down and discuss and be able to write an invoice to the West. But we were not able to do that. We only ended up coming up with that declaration. So whatever we set out to do, we didn't do it because of the influence of the others. And what the West were quickly able to come into play and just give a small token of appreciation and try to tell you guys, it's good you're doing these things, but you don't have to be so serious. We are still thinking about this thing. Because we walk around with a begging bowl, so somebody is able to play around with you. as Africans, we need to have a common front and be able to fight as a common. And unfortunately, when African Union is too weak, there are some efforts to be done, but as African Union, we need to stand up. But now, if the building you are sitting in itself is a token which you are given by some other people, and you really stand up against them. Yeah. So we are making steps. Yes, it's not lost on us that we are making steps, and then some individual countries like Kenya are making those steps. But then the interest from the West is so huge that we are not able to properly stand and point a finger. I mean, these are the same people you owe money.
So you can't.
But then in exchange, you want them to. You want on your side, you want to tax them. You know that also now.
Even the president,
the issue of conflict of interest.
Yeah, the president mentioned it at one period in time, saying that of course these countries we owe them debts, and therefore it is really hard then to
you pull up the climate change money. They tell
push
you,
the card on the
you
debt.
also owe us. You know, and now they are trying. The last COP which happened, I think there's also one which is happening. I think in somewhere in Czech Republic or somewhere around there. Yeah. The last one in Dubai, the argument was, how do we go around? The discussion was, how do we even enforce the payments? Then the discussion was, let's do it through the World Bank. The World Bank is largely a Western African institution. It's the West institution. So, you see, you are claiming this much from the World Bank, but then you owe them this much. Yeah. So the question would be, why don't we offset this?
Yeah, the balancing act.
Does that money get to the ground? It might not get. So we need a standalone agreement. As Africans, we need to claim a standalone process whereby we can be able to our people, because climate change is, while we're having this discussion on how the payment should be done, climate change is still affecting our people.
Yeah, it is.
So we need to stand on our feet and be able to say, no, these are separate arrangements. Cannot be able to mix them, but it's the interest of the West that they are mixed, so that Africa remains where it is, and they also don't pay up.
All right. Because of time, we'll have to take a break on that particular notch. But we'll be back talking about the issue of Africa. Do we bargain it as a continent, or do we go country alone? And also, what are these COP agreements bringing into the continent, and the COP, that we have in several parts of the continent, and also looking into the discussion of distribution of the monies gotten from the climate action issues. Do stay with us. We'll be back with much, much more.
Katika maisha yetu ya leo, wakulima na jamii nyingi kwa ujumla wanakumbatia teknolojia mbalimbali na kilimo hai ili kuondoa magonjwa sugu na kuongeza usalama na utoshelevu wa chakula. Mbolea asili imepunguza asidi kwenye udongo na kuongeza mavuno chungu nzima. Wajua tuko shambani, na humu shambani pia kuna ng'ombe, kuna kuku, na wanaacha uchafu wao. Na huo uchafu si wa kutupwa, ni wa kutumika katika kilimo kama mbolea. Kwa sababu mimea hii imekuwa kutumia mbolea ya hawa wanyama. Wakulima mbalimbali wamekumbatia teknolojia ili kuokoa gharama ya ukulima na kutumia nafasi zilizopo katika mashamba yao.
They are powerful and influential. They make decisions in politics, education, finance, agriculture, health, sports, and all aspects of human life. But the impact of their decisions falls on you, the common citizen. KUTV Primetime News Thursday. We ask bold questions and pursue answers to the core to bring you closer to the story. We couldn't have it any other way. Join me, Auma Evans, as I raise matters of social concern to raise your voice from the background to the foreground.
Welcome Welcome back. You're watching Law Matters. We are on the final segment of this particular show, looking into the issue of climate justice. Right now, we are bringing the discussion to a close, looking into the continent, looking into the funding, and what, as a country, we can do in terms of climate justice. Now, before we went for a break, Wakili, we are talking about how Africa finds itself in a catch-22 situation in terms of demanding for more, in terms of compensation, but at the same time, these countries are involved in terms of funding the nation. We owe them debts. So, do you think we should forge the agenda as a continent, given that we have failed to stand up together? We tried a common currency, it failed. We tried to have, a continent with one leader or appear to be united, it has failed. Do we go it country alone instead of the continent as one?
I fully agree. I think I want to agree with you that going it as the African front is the only way we can be able to manage serious development or change, or even having monies to combat climate change. Mm-hmm. I just gave an example earlier of the Sahara Desert. Sahara Desert cuts across Africa from one end to the other end. Mm-hmm. So if you go as a country, for example, Southern Sudan starts making its case, it does not have negotiators for that. Or if it could have its one, we need a concerted effort, a focused group for countries affected by common challenges to be able to bring these issues to the fore. You need your own experts to be able to have done the assessment and be able to come up with the correct figure. You need your own kind of bank where you can be able to say these monies are going to be paid to this bank. Look at the case of the African Development Bank. Who are the shareholders in the African Development Bank? It's largely the West. It only has the name African Development Bank, but the monies comes from the West, which is lent, to the African countries. So that cannot be a very independent institution. In terms of, because if it needs board, you have the World Bank sitting, America sitting, some Western countries sitting who have invested there. So this is how the African narrative is actually interfered with every time. We call for an African climate change meeting in Nairobi. Who are the keynote speakers? U.S. representative for climate change is the keynote speaker for an African agenda. You don't expect that that discussion is going to come or to give rise to something meaningful which really reflects the position of Africa. So we need to be able to, and I think you do realize that during that conference we were supposed to have Ramaphosa, we were supposed to have the president from Egypt. When they realized that they saw the agenda, they pulled out because they say this is not anything Africa. The agenda has already been overtaken. There's even rumors that even the text people came up with the Nairobi Accord were not actually Africans. They were just the African negotiators who were there were supposed to come up with a code. They also asking, we hear there is a document. So that tells you the interest. But it's a good effort. It was a strong declaration. But then we are able also to see how the West is really concerned and wants to derail everything that's coming from Africa in terms of demanding or standing up to the West to pay up. So those are some of the things which we need to look at. So looking at it from the African perspective sends cheaters to everybody who owe us money. But then the people who owe us money, we also owe them money. So that is where the discussion is lost. But I think the arrangement for us owing them money is a separate discussion which should be treated separately, and we be able to discuss what they owe us first.
Can you ever delink the discussion between what we owe them and the issues surrounding the key for climate justice or climate action? Is it a discussion that we can never win because it comes up every time?
Yes, it's a discussion we can win because we just need to set it clear that should not be raised in the table. What I owe you should not affect what I owe, because I owe you courtesy of an agreement.
So why does it always flop when it comes to the table? Because
influence, vested interest, African leaders being compromised, the West not willing to budge to pay up. So those are the key issues. Not only the West, because we also have the key emitters now are India and
The Asian countries?
India and China. The West are trying to work on their emissions. So there is also the accusation that there's not much effort from India and China, who are one of the biggest emitters now. So that discussion has got to be settled, and then we be able to write the fair check, and we receive our money towards mitigation, because we all live in this continent. Whatever happens in China affects us here.
Yeah.
Whatever happens in America affects us here. So we need to have an equitable way. That is why the discussion about climate justice is something which is timely, which we need to have very clear thoughts and very sober thinking towards resolving this. But the politics of you owe us, we owe you, is not going to help us. What we need to see is a concerted effort to come up with a framework which can be able to, for example, if I might just pull you one example, an interesting one. The Myanmar, the Prime Minister of, is it Barbados or one of the countries in the Caribbean? These small islands are facing extinction because of the rising waters in the oceans. So if something is not done, we are facing some few islands disappearing from the face of the earth. Where do we take these people? So the argument she was making, I really like following her discussions when it comes to the COP. And she has been very consistent, right from the one which was in Egypt, right to the one which was in Dubai. And I don't know, I'm hoping to see her in Baku, I think this year, which should be ongoing. She has been very consistent. We cannot lie to the world that these monies cannot be dispersed. It has ever been dispersed. What we are merely asking is something which has ever been done before. When COVID came, we saw central banks release monies towards mitigation, towards dealing with the issues of COVID. Why don't we deal with climate change the same way that this is a disaster, this is a catastrophe facing the world? Why should we allow people to die? Why should we allow islands to cease to exist, which are nations? So if we can be able to release these monies, all we need is the goodwill. If we have goodwill from all interested countries, climate change can actually be combated, and we are able to reduce the temperatures by up to 1.5, I believe.
Okay.
Yes, and make a world habitable.
So finally, because of time, I'm told to wind up in the next 2 minutes. When it comes to international financing support, how do we access these particular monies? Because they're given to the government in form of a grant, and the government can decide to use the money for other issues, including buying fertilizer and what have you. How do we ensure that we get these particular monies? Because they are for the people.
That is why I raised the discussion earlier that we have FLOCA. FLOCA is for dealing with rule law. And the best mechanism we came up with was to deal with counties, because now most of these effects are actually felt in the
It is from ground. The international support?
Yes, the money in FLOCA is not Kenyan money. Okay. It's money from the West, which has been deposited into the Kenyan government. You remember, you realize we had the discussion earlier that Kenya is on the forefront.
Yes.
So Kenya, these monies are deposited through the CBK and through the Treasury. And then these monies can be taken to the Ministry of Environment for purposes of planting the 15 billion trees. These monies can actually be deposited to the counties to deal with mitigation where there is flooding. So these monies should be able essentially to deal with the litigation where a community or a people have been affected, and once they sue, we are yet to see litigation at our courts. Once some fines or some amounts have been, compensation has been awarded to these people, these are the monies which are supposed to be dispersed to compensate these people. Okay. So we have a framework, right from the international to the ground. It's only that we need to ensure that there is compliance, we need to ensure that it goes everywhere. We need to train our people to be able to look at some of these things, because the government cannot be able to come and tell you have suffered climate change effects.
Yeah,
you need to know. So if our people do not know, they cannot be able to know what they ask for something they don't know.
Don't know.
So there is need to sensitize
Yeah.
I think climate change has always been thing. We need to start teaching climate change even from primary school levels. The environment subject, let's raise the climate change aspect so that our people are aware.
Yeah.
When we have people who are aware, then we will have a community which can be able to help itself.
Thank you so much, Wakili, for that perspective on climate justice. Of course, as you have listened in, as a country, we have been on the forefront compared to our peers, but we still have a long way to go in terms of having expert sensitization from the bottom down, from the bottom there all the way up, so that we can be able to face these issues surrounding climate change and also address the issue of climate justice for the sake of our communities. Because of time, we'll end it there. My name is Irene Mwangi. Do have yourselves a splendid night.
Are you an aspiring media practitioner, a graduate, or you just want to advance your skills in television production? Then welcome to Kenyatta University, where education meets innovation. Kutv, the premier university television station in Kenya, is now offering short courses in TV studio, field technical operations, and video editing. Through these courses, you will acquire hands-on skills on